The French Riviera was in its final bloom of summer when tragedy struck the glittering heart of Cap d'Antibes. On the private terrace of the illustrious Villa Calypso, guests reclined under a twilight sky where the horizon still shimmered gold and lavender. The champagne flowed, laughter crackled through the bougainvillea-draped arches, and a string quartet added a touch of refinement to the evening's opulence. But by midnight, one of society's most enigmatic women was dead. Killed, it seemed, by the very toast she made. Lady Isabel Carrington had always been a figure of myth and magnetism, a former stage actress turned hostess of infamously intimate soirees. She knew how to keep her guests amused and uneasy. Her guest lists were carefully curated collisions of the glamorous and the desperate, the witty and the wicked. Invitations to Villa Calypso were coveted across Europe, for an evening with Lady Carrington was as likely to yield a scandal as it was a new fortune. On the night of her demise, Lady Carrington raised her glass at precisely 10 minutes to midnight, her striking emerald gown glinting under the terrace lanterns. She smiled, a slow, practiced thing, and with that smooth theatrical delivery that had once silenced West End crowds, she declared, "To old secrets, never told, and to new friends, never trusted." The laughter was polite, confused, nervous. Her eyes scanned the party, pausing an imperceptible second too long on each of her guests. Then she drank. A moment later, she clutched her throat, staggered, and collapsed, glass still in hand. By 12:05 a.m., she was dead. Poison, certainly. Swift and lethal. News of the death swept the Riviera faster than gossip over Café Crème. The local police, quick to act but baffled by the complexity of the social web within Villa Calypso, sent word to Monaco, where a certain celebrated Belgian detective was spending a fortnight in quiet contemplation of architecture and the superiority of French butter. It was Chief Inspector Lucien Marchand who made the call. He had worked with Poirot once before on the matter of the Marseilles catacombs, and had never forgotten how the little man with the waxed moustache and faultless attire had managed to outwit the entire Marseille police bureau with little more than a pocket mirror and a bowl of lavender water. Now, Lucien Marchand needed that brilliance again. By the following morning, Hercule Poirot arrived at Villa Calypso. The estate was a pale sandstone masterpiece nestled into the cliffs above the Mediterranean, accessible only by a winding private road flanked with oleander. As Poirot stepped from the car, he adjusted his bow tie, brushed invisible dust from his lapels, and surveyed the scene with a faint narrowing of the eyes. He was greeted by the inspector himself. "Merci, Monsieur Poirot. I feared I might not reach you in time," Marchand said, shaking his hand. Poirot gave a modest bow. "You are fortunate, mon ami. I had just concluded an unsatisfactory breakfast and was in no mood to admire fountains. Now, murder, that is another matter." They entered through the grand atrium, past a towering floral arrangement that now seemed garish under the circumstances, and into the salon where the guests had been gathered. 8 of them remained, each with a thin veneer of composure that high society demands, yet each bearing the signs of something deeper: fatigue, anxiety, calculation. Poirot's eyes flicked briefly over each face. 8 suspects, 1 dead hostess, and, as he suspected, a dozen lies waiting to unravel. Lady Isabel Carrington's body had already been removed, but the champagne flute she held in death had been preserved under a glass dome on a side table, at Poirot's instruction. He did not examine it immediately. Instead, he turned to face the assembled group, clasping his hands neatly before him. "I am Hercule Poirot," he announced. "You will forgive me if I forgo the social pleasantries, but in the matter of murder, time is both precious and treacherous." There was a pause, broken only by the brittle clink of someone setting down a glass too quickly. Poirot continued. "Lady Carrington, it seems, was killed in full view of her guests, a public death, with a private motive. This is not a crime of opportunity. It is one of planning, of psychology. I intend to speak with each of you in turn. Mais d'abord, first, I will make a few observations." He paced the room slowly, his gaze never fixed on any one person, but always watchful. There was no food served with the final toast, no opportunity to tamper with her drink after the pour. The champagne was from a fresh bottle, uncorked by the butler in your presence, yes? A nod came from a lean man with silver temples and a stiff collar. Davenport, the butler. And yet only her glass was poisoned. The poison, therefore, was either placed in the glass beforehand, or, more subtly, introduced in a manner most clever. Poirot paused before a young woman perched nervously on the edge of a velvet chaise. "You look troubled, mademoiselle." I'm sorry," she stammered. "It's just all so ghastly. I keep thinking of her face." She smiled when she said that toast, but it was the kind of smile you wear when you're afraid. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Ah, so you noticed that too." As the guests shifted uncomfortably, Poirot began the meticulous task of dissecting their alibis, relationships, and grievances. He would start with the obvious. A jilted lover, an estranged stepdaughter, a former business partner with debts too numerous to count. But Poirot knew that the solution would not lie in the expected. "No," he thought, as he examined the champagne glass at last, turning it slowly under the light, "the real motive will be personal, not criminal. Someone in this room had killed Lady Carrington, not to cover up a scandal, but to silence something far more dangerous. The truth. And Poirot, with his little grey cells already humming, had every intention of discovering what that truth was. Poirot's inspection of the glass was brief but thorough, and with a final, knowing glance, he set it back on the table. He did not immediately ask for details about the guests' whereabouts during the toast. Those would come in time. Instead, his focus shifted to the guests themselves, each of whom seemed to carry the weight of some hidden knowledge, as if each of them had a part to play in Lady Carrington's death, yet none were brave enough to act out their role in the open. Poirot turned slowly and cast his gaze across the room, as if searching for some clue that would reveal a deeper pattern. His eyes paused briefly on each person before moving on, and the silence that followed his movements grew palpable. No one dared to speak until he addressed them directly. "Monsieur Davenport," Poirot said softly, his eyes settling on the butler. "You have been with Lady Carrington for many years, have you not?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot," Davenport replied stiffly, his back straight as an iron rod. "Nearly 15 years I've served her." 15 years, Poirot mused, nodding as though processing the information. "You know her habits well, I suppose? Her preferences, the subtle changes in her mood. Would it be too bold of me to ask if she ever mentioned anything about feeling threatened in her final days?" The butler's gaze flickered for just a moment, too brief to be noticed by anyone but Poirot. His expression remained impassive, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. "No, monsieur," he said, his voice clipped. "I'm afraid I cannot help you there." Poirot smiled slightly, a faint curve that conveyed no humor. "Ah, but Monsieur Davenport, you misunderstand me. It is not a question of your knowledge, but of your perception. You, I presume, are adept at noticing things others might overlook. The look in a person's eyes, perhaps when they have a secret to guard, or the way their hands tremble slightly when they lie." The butler's eyes widened just a fraction, and Poirot's smile deepened. "Your calm exterior betrays you, monsieur. I wonder, did you not feel some hint of the storm that gathered in your mistress' life just before she made that toast?" Davenport stiffened, but he did not answer immediately. Poirot pressed on, walking slowly around the room, his eyes never leaving the butler. She seemed to have an uncanny way of making people feel uncomfortable, did she not? A woman with secrets, yes? And people who keep secrets often hide behind a mask of confidence. You, monsieur, are no different You wear your mask well." Finally, Davenport spoke, his voice tight. "I have served Lady Carrington loyally, Monsieur Poirot, and I would never harm her." Poirot nodded, but he was not convinced. His mind already danced from one possible thread to another, sensing an intricate web of motives just beyond the surface. He turned away from the butler and allowed his gaze to rest on the other members of the gathering. There was Henrietta Vane, the young actress who had arrived in the city only a week before, already a fixture at Lady Carrington's parties. She was the picture of innocence, wide-eyed, soft-spoken, and visibly shaken. Yet Poirot knew better than to be deceived by appearances. There was something about her expression that suggested not just shock, but guilt. The way she clutched her champagne flute a little too tightly, the way her eyes darted toward the door as if she were planning her escape. These were not signs of someone who had merely witnessed a death. They were the signs of someone who might have played a role in it. Poirot's attention shifted to Robert Stone, the businessman, a man of imposing presence and sharp features. His tailor-made suit spoke of wealth and status, but it was the cold calculation in his eyes that caught Poirot's attention. There was something else about him, something unspoken in the way he stood, the slight rigidity in his posture, as though he were waiting for the right moment to strike, to make his move. Then there was Valerie, Lady Carrington's stepdaughter. She had always been the quiet one, the reserved one, yet it was clear that her silence hid something much darker. She had not wept at her mother's death. Not once. Instead, she had stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit sea, as though she were lost in thought or plotting. Poirot had made his observations, but the questions remained. Who had stood to gain from Lady Carrington's death? Whose secrets were in danger of being exposed? Who would go so far as to poison her? He began his interviews quietly, a methodical approach that would slowly wear down the facade of each person before him. "Madame Vane," Poirot said, his voice gentle as he approached the actress. "You look as though you have not slept for many hours. Was Lady Carrington's death truly a shock to you, or did you, perhaps, have some inkling that something was amiss?" Henrietta Vane's wide eyes widened even further, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "Monsieur Poirot, I don't know what you mean. I had no idea. I swear it on my life. I had no reason to wish her harm." Poirot nodded gravely, but there was no mistaking the faintest tremor in her voice. "Ah, but you do not need to wish her harm for it to be so, madame. Sometimes it is the smallest of actions, a careless word, a fleeting glance, that leads to tragedy. You were very close to Lady Carrington, were you not? She took you under her wing. Perhaps you, like so many others, sought something from her?" The actress's face was a study in emotions, but none of them seemed to be the truth. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, just long enough for Henrietta to fidget in her seat. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of her lies was too much to bear. I wanted her approval. To be someone in this world, to be more than just a chorus girl." Her voice dropped to a whisper. She promised me. She promised me that if I played my part well, I would have everything. And then she changed. She started to act strange, as if she knew something about me, about my past. I don't know what it was, but I feared she would expose me. Poirot did not respond immediately. He allowed her words to sink into the atmosphere of the room, where they hung like a storm cloud waiting to burst. It was clear that Henrietta Vane had more to hide than she was willing to admit, but whether that secret was enough to kill, Poirot was not yet certain. He moved on, now addressing Robert Stone, the businessman with ice in his veins. "Monsieur Stone," Poirot said, his voice clipped and precise, "I imagine you have more to lose than most. You are involved in certain enterprises with Lady Carrington, are you not?" Stone met Poirot's gaze with an intensity that bordered on disdain. "I have no idea what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. My business dealings are perfectly legitimate." Poirot's lips twitched slightly. Ah, monsieur, but you see, I do not ask about the legality of your business. No, I'm more interested in the morality of your dealings. Tell me, were you aware that Lady Carrington had recently begun to make some rather bold choices regarding her investments? Stone's gaze darkened. She was a fool, always throwing money at frivolous schemes. I warned her that her debts would catch up with her, but she didn't listen. That was all. He paused, eyes flashing. And if you're implying that I killed her for money, you're gravely mistaken. Poirot studied him, his expression unreadable. I imply nothing, Monsieur Stone. I merely observe that those with debts often have a reason to remove obstacles in their way. The businessman's jaw tightened, but he did not reply. Poirot stepped back, surveying the room again, his mind working quickly through the newly gathered pieces. Each person had a reason, a motive, a secret. But somewhere, one of them was lying about something far more significant. Lady Carrington's final words rang in his mind. To old secrets, never told, and to new friends, never trusted. What was it that Lady Carrington had uncovered? What was so dangerous that it warranted a deadly silence? Poirot took a deep breath. He was not yet ready to make his move, but the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. Poirot's mind was a storm of conflicting threads, each one tugging him in different directions. The pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered across the room, in the words of the guests and the behaviors that had seemed too calculated to be mere coincidence. But something about the scene troubled him. The lines of logic were there, but there was a subtlety, too, the crime that made it feel different from the usual. He cast his gaze over the assembled guests once more, his eyes lingering on each of them, not just for what they had said, but for what they had not said. In particular, Valerie, the quiet stepdaughter, had attracted his attention. She had been the least forthcoming of all, her silence now heavy in the air, as if she were retreating into some interior world of her own. Yet in her stillness, Poirot sensed a depth that others lacked, a subtlety of emotion that even her mother had perhaps never understood. He approached her slowly, the soft click of his polished shoes against the marble floor echoing in the silence. Valerie remained near the window, her back to the room, staring out at the dark sea. The wind had picked up, and the scent of salt water seemed to swirl into the room as the terrace doors creaked open slightly. Mademoiselle Valerie, Poirot began, his voice gentle but firm. You stand there like a figure in a painting, one that may have long ago forgotten its purpose. It is strange, no? How time moves so swiftly, yet we remain frozen in place. Valerie did not turn, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. I am not in the mood for riddles, Monsieur Poirot, she replied, her voice low and controlled. Poirot tilted his head slightly, examining her still form. There was something in her response that triggered a faint memory, a pattern he had seen before, a common reaction in those with something to hide. The defensiveness, the sharpness in her voice, it was too practiced, too deliberate. Mademoiselle, your mother's death has shaken you deeply, I am certain, Poirot said, his voice softening almost as if speaking to a child. But there is something else that stirs beneath your calm facade. Something deeper than grief, perhaps fear. Her shoulders stiffened at the word, but still she did not turn to face him. Poirot waited in silence, his sharp eyes noting every minute change in her posture, every shift of her breath. He allowed the quiet to fill the room until finally she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what it was like, Monsieur Poirot. You don't know what it's like to watch someone take everything from you and then offer you nothing in return. The words were almost lost, carried away by the wind. But Poirot caught them and he leaned in closer, his tone now full of quiet understanding. Ah, mademoiselle, I think I do understand. You were not always the daughter in this arrangement, were you? There was a time when your mother was more than just a stepmother. She was a rival, perhaps. A woman who came into your life with promises she could not keep. Valerie's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "You don't know anything about us," she said, her voice trembling now, just slightly. "My mother was not a good woman. She did things. I don't know why, but she did. I could never escape her. And now she's dead. That's all I need to know." Poirot's gaze softened. "But did she deserve to die for what she did to you? To force you into silence, into this life of shadows? The truth is often far more complex than the anger we feel in the moment." She did not respond, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside, where the waves crashed against the shore. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Poirot could feel the weight of her confession hanging in the air, but there was no guilt, no immediate sense of remorse. Her silence said far more than words could. After a pause, Poirot nodded to himself, his mind already moving on. There was something about Valerie's response that felt calculated, but it was not the breakthrough he sought. His next move would have to come from a different angle, for the puzzle pieces were still too scattered, the motivations too clouded. He turned to face the others again, his eyes flicking from one suspect to the next. Henrietta Vane was still sitting nervously on the chaise, her legs crossed, her hands twisting the edge of her sleeve. Robert Stone stood by the fireplace now, his expression one of barely contained tension. Davenport remained as ever, stoic and unmoving, his eyes carefully neutral. They all seemed to be waiting for something, a signal perhaps, or a moment to escape. Poirot's attention shifted to the butler. "Monsieur Davenport," he called out, his voice calm but piercing. "You were with Lady Carrington just before her toast. You saw her, yes? Did she seem different that evening, more than just her usual self?" Davenport blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "She was? Well, Madame was always a bit theatrical, but she did seem distracted, yes. It was as if she were expecting something." "Expecting something," Poirot repeated, leaning in just slightly. "Tell me, monsieur, you served her a glass of champagne, did you not?" "Yes, I did," Davenport replied, his voice a little unsteady now. "But I swear, I did nothing wrong. I poured the drinks like I always do. I was just doing my job." Poirot studied him for a moment. "Your job?" "Yes. But did you notice anything unusual in her behavior before the toast? Did she seem nervous, perhaps?" Davenport hesitated, then shook his head. "Not exactly nervous, no. But there was something unsettling in her eyes, a kind of knowing look." Poirot's mind whirred. "Knowing," he murmured. "Indeed. And what, monsieur, did she know?" "I don't know," the butler said quickly, his voice rising in agitation. "But she told me something that night. She said, 'The end is near. I finally found the answer.' I didn't understand what she meant, but she seemed very sure of herself." Poirot's gaze sharpened. That was it. The key. Lady Carrington had known. She had known something that had made her feel vulnerable, perhaps, or even threatened. The solution to the mystery was not just in her death. It was in what she had learned, something so dangerous that it had forced her hand. "What was the answer, I wonder?" Poirot muttered aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "And why did she choose that night to speak of it?" He turned toward the others, his face inscrutable. "I think it is time we discuss the matter more fully. No, to uncover the truth, as it has been hidden in plain sight." The room seemed to close in around them as Poirot stood there, pondering the tangled web of lies and half-truths that connected them all. Someone here had killed Lady Carrington, not just to protect a secret, but to keep it buried, and Poirot would not rest until that secret was brought to light. Poirot stood, his mind now clicking into overdrive. He had felt the tremors of truth beneath the surface for some time, but now it was almost as if the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The moment when Lady Carrington had whispered those cryptic words, "The end is near. I finally found the answer, was not just a passing statement, but a crucial key. What had she found? And more importantly, what had she meant by it? The guests in the room remained frozen, each one waiting for Poirot to make his next move. Their eyes followed his every gesture, and Poirot could feel the weight of their collective guilt, or perhaps their fear of being exposed, pressing against him. Yet there was something else lurking, something in the air that shifted with each passing second. It was the tension of a game that had just begun, where the rules were only now being revealed. He glanced at Robert Stone, the young man who had been so quick to distance himself from the events surrounding Lady Carrington's death. Stone's clenched fists, his nervous glances toward the window, and his inability to meet Poirot's gaze spoke volumes. Was he merely upset by the tragedy, or was his anxiety a sign of something deeper? Poirot had observed him closely during their earlier conversation, and the impression that Stone was hiding something had only grown stronger. Poirot's attention turned to Henrietta Vane, whose discomfort seemed to grow with each moment that passed. She had been the most vocal of the group, yet there was a hollowness in her words, as if she were simply trying to fill the silence with whatever sounded plausible. What, Poirot wondered, did she stand to gain from Lady Carrington's death? What was her connection to the woman? Then there was Valerie. Silent, withdrawn, and yet present in a way that seemed to stand out. Valerie's motivations were still the most elusive, but Poirot had sensed that her struggle with her mother had run deeper than simple resentment. It was as though she had been pushed into a corner, forced into a position where her loyalty could no longer be trusted. He took a step toward the group, his hands clasped behind his back as he spoke with calm deliberation. Ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves at a crossroads. The case of Lady Carrington's death is not one of simple murder. It is, in fact, a murder of circumstance, a death that is born not from a single action, but from the consequences of a series of secrets. Each of you, in your own way, is part of this puzzle. But none of you, I suspect, are quite as innocent as you would have me believe. The room shifted uncomfortably, but Poirot's gaze did not falter. He was in command now, guiding them forward, pushing them toward the truth. Let us begin with what we know, Poirot continued, his voice steady. Lady Carrington, as we know, was killed by poisoning. The glass of champagne she drank contained something lethal, something that would have been almost impossible to detect without the proper tools. But that is not the important part, is it? The important part is that she drank it knowingly. Henrietta Vane stiffened at this, her eyes darting toward the window. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of fear. Poirot's eyes flicked to her, sharp and unyielding. "I mean that Lady Carrington knew she was being poisoned. She had every reason to suspect that someone in this room meant her harm, but she did not run, she did not cry for help. No, she chose to drink the glass and to speak those last words. The end is near. I finally found the answer." "What do you suppose that means, Monsieur Stone?" Stone swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked over at Valerie, as if searching for some sign from her, but Valerie only stared back, unblinking. Stone cleared his throat. "It sounds like she was being dramatic, like it was some sort of final statement." Poirot shook his head slightly. "No, monsieur, this was not a statement of mere theatrics. Lady Carrington had found something she believed to be crucial, and she had a reason to believe that it was the final piece of a long, unfolding mystery." The butler, Davenport, who had remained silent up until now, shifted uncomfortably. She mentioned something about secrets, about things being hidden." Poirot's attention snapped to him, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. "Ah, Monsieur Davenport, it is not just the poison that ties you to this case, but your own role as a keeper of secrets. You know more than you have let on, and perhaps it is you who has been hiding the most." Davenport's eyes widened, but his face remained impassive. "I have no secrets, Monsieur Poirot," he said quickly. "I am simply a servant." Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. "Ah, but even the smallest of servants can carry great weight, n'est-ce pas? You're not here to serve only the Carrington family. You are here to ensure that certain things remain hidden, and I think you may have been a part of what Lady Carrington discovered before her death." The butler's face tightened, but he remained silent, his hands folded in front of him. Poirot turned his gaze back to the others, feeling the pressure mount in the room. "It is clear to me now," he said, his voice calm but laden with meaning. "The person who killed Lady Carrington did so because she had uncovered something that threatened everything they had worked to protect. What was she trying to reveal? That is the key question, isn't it?" Robert Stone, who had been fidgeting by the window, suddenly spoke. "What are you implying, Poirot? Are you suggesting that one of us knew about this, that someone here had something to gain from her death?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice lowering. "I'm not implying anything, Monsieur Stone. I'm stating facts. The key to Lady Carrington's death lies in what she knew. Someone in this room had the most to lose from the truth coming out. Someone wanted to silence her before she could expose whatever secret she had uncovered." Henrietta let out a soft gasp. "You think one of us killed her to protect a secret?" she asked, incredulous. Poirot's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. "But of course. And I suspect that the secret is far more dangerous than any of you realize." The room fell silent again, each of the guests casting furtive glances at one another. For a moment, Poirot allowed the tension to build, to make the air thick with uncertainty. He could see it in their eyes, the fear, the hesitation, the unspoken knowledge that each one of them might be hiding something far more damning than they had admitted. It was then that he realized something else. Someone in this room had made a mistake. A slip of the tongue, a glance, a misplaced word. Something that would expose them. It was only a matter of time before Poirot uncovered it. He turned toward the door. "It is time for the truth to be revealed. We must all now face what has been concealed, for in the end, the answer is there, waiting to be found." As the guests shifted uneasily, Poirot stood still, his mind already turning over the final pieces of the puzzle. The end was near indeed. And when it came, it would be the revelation of a truth no one had expected. The room grew still, the weight of Poirot's words hanging heavily in the air. Each person seemed lost in their own thoughts, trying to wrap their minds around the implications of what had been said. Poirot stood, his posture rigid, his eyes calculating as they swept over the faces before him. Each guest in the room held their breath, waiting as if the smallest movement might give away their guilt. Poirot did not hurry to speak. Instead, he let the silence linger, aware that this was a game of psychology, a game of patience. He had learned long ago that people, when placed under pressure, would reveal their true selves, if only one was clever enough to watch. He turned his attention to the butler, Davenport, who had not moved since the moment Poirot had implicated him. The man's stillness was not the calm of innocence, but the rigidity of a man who was perhaps too practiced at hiding his emotions. Poirot had seen this before. Davenport was not as unaffected as he seemed. "You are, how do you say, a man who takes his duties seriously, Monsieur Davenport," Poirot remarked, his voice laced with a gentle mockery. "A man of great discretion, but the truth, it seems, is not so easily concealed, is it?" Davenport's lips pressed tightly together, his jaw working beneath his skin. He straightened, but only slightly, and for a moment Poirot could have sworn he saw a flash of panic in the man's eyes. Then, as if pushing it down, Davenport bowed his head slightly, his expression stoic once more. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Monsieur Poirot," the butler said quietly, his voice betraying nothing. Poirot nodded slowly. Of course. But you see, Monsieur Davenport, there is a small problem with your story. You mentioned earlier that Lady Carrington had been upset. She was worried about something, wasn't she? Perhaps she had uncovered something that threatened your well-ordered world. The butler's eyes flicked to the side, his fingers twitching ever so slightly. Poirot had struck a nerve. Madame Carrington was a woman of many concerns, Davenport replied evenly. Her mind was often occupied with matters I could not comprehend. Poirot smiled faintly, sensing victory. Ah, but it is not the matters you comprehend that interest me, monsieur. It is the ones you would rather keep hidden. He took a step closer, eyes fixed on the butler's face, reading every subtle shift in expression. Tell me, Monsieur Davenport, what exactly did she uncover? What was so dangerous that you felt compelled to hide it, or perhaps to silence it forever? A bead of sweat formed at the edge of Davenport's temple. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Poirot wondered if the man would crack under the pressure. But then, as if suddenly realizing he was cornered, Davenport took a step back. "This is absurd," he exclaimed, his voice rising ever so slightly. "I have done nothing wrong. Lady Carrington was... She was simply a woman with too many questions, too many suspicions." Poirot nodded, his voice soft, almost pitying. But those suspicions were justified, were they not? Lady Carrington did not die from an accident, monsieur. She was murdered, and someone in this room has been hiding the truth for far too long. There was a long silence as Davenport locked eyes with Poirot. The tension in the room was palpable, and Poirot felt the weight of the other's scrutiny. He was acutely aware of the quiet, almost imperceptible glances being exchanged between the guests, those small signs of guilt, of fear. But the most telling look, Poirot noted, came from Robert Stone, whose posture had shifted as though he were now uncertain of his own position in the room. Poirot's gaze turned to Stone. The young man had been quiet since the initial confrontation, but Poirot could see that the silence was beginning to gnaw at him. His fingers gripped the back of a chair tightly, as though he sought something solid to hold on to. His earlier defensiveness was now tempered with a new sense of unease. "Monsieur Stone," Poirot began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "you have been rather silent throughout our conversation, and I do not believe it is simply the grief over your mother's death that has rendered you speechless. No, I think there is something more at play here. You see, I have noticed the way your eyes dart to the window whenever certain topics are brought up. You are not the calm and collected young man you would like everyone to believe. I sense a great deal of turmoil beneath that polished exterior." Stone's face flushed with color, his lips parted as though to respond, but no words came out. Poirot pressed on, his tone gentle but insistent. "Tell me, Monsieur Stone, what is it that you are so afraid of? What secret were you trying to protect?" At the mention of secrets, Henrietta Vane shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering between Stone and Poirot, the tension in the air becoming unbearable. Valerie, too, was watching the exchange closely, her face unreadable, but Poirot could see the faintest hint of something in her eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or something darker. It was clear that the investigation was reaching its boiling point. Finally, Stone spoke, his voice shaky but determined. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I loved my mother. I had nothing to do with her death." Poirot nodded, as if acknowledging a truth that was not quite the whole truth. "Of course, Monsieur Stone. But love can often cloud one's judgment, and love, when it becomes possessive, can lead to actions one might regret." Stone's face twisted in confusion, but Poirot was not finished. "You see, Robert, your relationship with your mother was not as it appeared. You resented her, didn't you? You resented her marriage, the life she led after your father's death. You felt abandoned by her, and when she started to distance herself from you, you became angry. Did you not?" The young man's breath hitched, and his hands clenched at his sides. "No," he muttered, shaking his head in denial. "No, that's not true." Poirot leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "But it is true, isn't it? You were angry with her for leaving you, and when she started to change, to speak of things she was afraid of, you saw her as a threat, threatening to expose what you had worked so hard to bury. The air seemed to thicken around them, and Poirot could feel the eyes of the others on him, waiting for the truth to unfold. "But there is something else," Poirot said, his voice low and certain. "Something that ties you all together. Something you all wish to hide. The game, you see, is not yet over. You have each played your part, knowingly or unknowingly, and now it is time to reveal the final move. The end is near, but the truth has only just begun." For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing, deep, slow, deliberate. Poirot's eyes scanned the room once more, his mind already working through the next steps of the investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the endgame was close. But for now, they would all have to wait. The final revelation, Poirot knew, would come when they least expected it. Poirot folded his hands behind his back and turned from the fireplace, where the embers glowed dimly in the fading afternoon light. He crossed slowly to the window, where a fine drizzle traced serpentine patterns on the glass. Behind him, the silence lingered like a held breath. He had pressed Robert stone hard, and deliberately so. The young man had not cracked, but Poirot knew the hairline fractures were there. He did not expect the truth to emerge through bluster or confession. No, the human heart revealed itself not in declarations, but in moments, fleeting, unguarded moments when the mask slipped. That was what he watched for. A quiet knock interrupted the tension. Mrs. Ridgway, the housekeeper, entered with the poise of someone long accustomed to moving unnoticed. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a hesitant glance toward the assembled guests, "there's something you may wish to see." Poirot turned, one eyebrow lifted. "But of course, madame." "Lead the way." She led him down the hallway to the late Lady Carrington's study. Poirot noted how deliberately the door had been shut and the curtains drawn, as if to protect the room from the eyes of the living. Mrs. Ridgway crossed to the desk and produced a small leather-bound book. "She kept a diary," she said in a low voice. "I know it's not my place, but I couldn't help noticing. The last few entries. They were troubling. I thought, well, if there's to be justice, someone should read them." Poirot gave a slight bow of his head in acknowledgement. "Madame, it is most courageous of you. Sometimes justice begins not with the law, but with conscience." She left him alone. Poirot sat at the desk and carefully opened the diary. The entries began a few weeks earlier, elegant handwriting, sharp observations, a certain clipped wit. But as the days passed, a change crept into the tone. "Robert is more distant than ever," one entry read. "He broods. I think he resents my decision to sell the house. I cannot live among ghosts." Poirot's brow furrowed. That had not been mentioned before. He flipped forward. "There's something not right about Davenport." He asked me again if I'd reconsider the move. His interest is oddly possessive. I sometimes wonder if he forgets who employs whom. And then, just 3 days before her death. "I'm being watched, not just by Davenport. There's someone else. I saw a figure on the terrace last night. I thought it might be Henrietta, but the figure was too tall. Could Valerie have returned early? But why would she hide?" Poirot closed the diary slowly, digesting the implications. Lady Carrington had feared something, and it had not been a vague anxiety. It was specific. The idea that Valerie might have returned earlier than she admitted was interesting. More so was her decision not to share these suspicions with anyone openly. But perhaps she had tried. Moments later, Poirot re-entered the drawing room. His expression was unreadable, but his step was brisk. "Mes amis," he said, "we shall have another small conversation. Mademoiselle Henrietta, if you please." Henrietta straightened, visibly surprised. "Yes? You and Lady Carrington, how close were you in these final weeks?" I visited her often, Henrietta replied cautiously. She was lonely. After her decision to sell the house, I think she needed reassurance. Ah, so you were aware of her plans to sell? Henrietta hesitated, then nodded. She told me. She said the house held too many painful memories. She was going to take a flat in London. And what did Monsieur Stone think of this decision? A flicker of discomfort passed across Henrietta's face. He was upset. They argued. He thought she was abandoning the legacy of the family, his father's memory especially. Indeed, Poirot's voice softened. Mademoiselle, forgive me, but I must ask. On the night of Lady Carrington's death, you said you went upstairs shortly before 11. Did you hear anything unusual? Henrietta looked at him sharply. No, only the storm. It was dreadful. Thunder all night. No voices? No footsteps? She shook her head. No. And yet Lady Carrington wrote in her diary that she suspected someone of watching her the night before. She even thought it might have been you, before dismissing the idea due to the height of the figure. Henrietta blanched. She thought, me. Poirot watched her carefully. She feared someone in this house, and I believe she attempted to confront them, or at least corner them into revealing themselves. It is why she insisted the gathering go on despite the storm. Henrietta opened her mouth, then shut it again. At that moment, Valerie Carrington rose slowly from her chair. Her voice cut through the thick silence. All of you keep talking as though you know what happened. But none of you do. I do. All eyes turned to her. Poirot tilted his head. You have remembered something, Madame Carrington? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I didn't forget. I lied. There was a sharp intake of breath from Robert. I did return to the house the night before the party, she continued. I didn't want anyone to know. I'd argued with Eleanor about money. Yes, I admit that. I didn't want it getting out. The press would have had a field day if it looked like I was groveling for a share of Raymond Carrington's estate. So you came here in secret? Poirot asked. Valerie nodded. I arrived late. I meant only to talk to Eleanor, to plead my case. But when I got here, I saw someone else entering through the garden. I hid. I saw them go inside through the side door. They had a key. Who? Poirot asked sharply. She hesitated. It was Davenport. A murmur rippled through the room. The butler's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. I followed him as far as the library window, Valerie went on. He went straight to Eleanor's study. I couldn't hear what they said, but she looked frightened. She shouted something, then she slapped him. He left a few minutes later. I didn't dare go inside after that. Why not tell us this before? Asked Henrietta. I was ashamed, Valerie replied. Ashamed I'd hidden. Ashamed I hadn't done more. Poirot stepped forward slowly. And, Madame Carrington, did you return again the next night? No, she said firmly. I left early that morning and returned only after I heard about her death. Poirot studied her. There was something about the story that held, too rigidly perhaps, but it matched the diary, and it complicated Davenport's account considerably. Monsieur Davenport? Poirot said mildly. You told us you left Lady Carrington alone at 11, yet someone else places you at her study door the night before. Davenport's mouth twisted. I went to express concern, that is all. She was not herself, and I certainly did not harm her. And yet, Poirot murmured, her diary suggests she believed otherwise. He turned back to the group, eyes glittering. This house, it is like a theatre. Every person plays a part, every gesture rehearsed. But the truth, mes amis, it peeks from behind the curtain, and I believe we are nearly ready to lift it fully. Poirot glanced down at his watch. One more matter to investigate. One last string to tug. And then, I think, we shall see the entire tapestry unravel. The house was quieter than ever before. The tension had settled, thick as a fog, hanging over the group like an unspoken threat. Poirot had no doubt that the pieces were coming together, but as always, there was a final element missing. A subtle detail, hidden from plain view, that only his little grey cells could tease into clarity. He stood in the drawing room, his gaze sweeping across the assembled suspects. Robert Stone, pale and fidgeting. Henrietta, her fingers nervously twisting the lace of her gloves. Davenport, who had withdrawn into his usual implacable calm, and Valerie Carrington, who had told her story but was not yet free from suspicion. Poirot's eyes then fell on Mrs. Ridgway, who had been standing silently by the side, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had been mostly quiet since her revelation of the diary, but Poirot sensed she knew more than she let on. She was careful, precise, a trait he valued in others, but when mixed with her reticence, it raised questions. Madame Ridgway, Poirot began, his voice smooth, his gaze steady. You mentioned earlier that you had found the diary after Lady Carrington's death, but it was locked away in the study. How, if I may ask, did you come across it? The question was direct, and Mrs. Ridgway's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced briefly at the others before answering, her voice low but steady. I found it in the desk drawer. When the police had finished their initial search, I went in to tidy up. The diary was tucked away under some papers. I assumed it had been forgotten. Poirot nodded slowly, but his sharp eyes were still on her. There was something in her tone, a slight hesitation before the word forgotten that did not sit right with him. And the last entry, Poirot continued. You said you noticed it was troubling. What did you think when you read it? Mrs. Ridgway's eyes flickered. I thought it was strange. That Lady Carrington felt someone was watching her, but of course I had no way of knowing what that meant at the time. Poirot gave a slight, knowing smile. No, madame? But you do now, yes? She was silent for a moment, then gave a small nod. Yes. Tell me, Madame Ridgway, Poirot said softly, did you happen to be aware of any disagreements between Lady Carrington and Monsieur Davenport? She blinked, a sharp breath escaping her lips. Disagreements? No, I don't know. They were always civil. Civil but distant, Poirot interjected, his voice as soft as a whisper but cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. You see, Madame Ridgway, I believe you know more about the evening before Lady Carrington died than you are telling us. You were not just a witness to the affair. You were part of it. The housekeeper's face paled, but she stood firm. I don't know what you mean. I'm simply here to help. Poirot tilted his head slightly, his fingers tapping together in his usual gesture. Ah, but you have been helping, madame. You have been playing your part all along. The real question is, why? Mrs. Ridgway's lips parted, but no sound came out. The others watched in quiet disbelief, as if this was a new twist that even they had not anticipated. Henrietta glanced at Davenport, whose impassive face betrayed no sign of guilt. Or did it? Poirot stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the housekeeper's face. You have been loyal, madame, loyal to your employer, but loyalty, while commendable, does not always lead to the truth. You knew something about Lady Carrington's plans to sell the house. You knew she was not simply abandoning her family legacy, as you told us earlier. She was in the process of trying to remove someone from her life. Mrs. Ridgway swallowed, her voice faltering. I didn't want to get involved. It was none of my business. None of your business, Poirot asked softly, his voice deceptively calm. Yet you were the one who knew about the argument between Lady Carrington and her son, Robert. You knew she feared for her safety. She knew, in fact, that something was wrong. There was a long pause. Finally, Mrs. Ridgway exhaled, a resigned sigh escaping her. It was Davenport. He had been threatening her. Not directly, of course. He never said it out loud, but it was in the way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her when he thought no one was paying attention. Poirot's sharp gaze did not leave her, and yet he remained in the house as her confidant. "Why did you not report this earlier, madame?" Mrs. Ridgway shifted uneasily, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I didn't want to cause a scandal. It was a delicate situation. Lady Carrington was afraid of what might happen if things got out of hand. She had no one else to turn to." "But that's not the full truth, is it?" Poirot asked, leaning forward. "You didn't want to get involved because you had your own reasons for protecting Monsieur Davenport. He had something over you, didn't he? A secret, perhaps something that would ruin you if it came to light." Mrs. Ridgway's eyes dropped to the floor. The silence stretched long until she whispered, "He knew about my past. Before I came to work for Lady Carrington, I was involved with someone dangerous, and if it ever came out, if the truth came out, I would lose everything. I would have no place left to go." The confession hung in the air like a heavy weight. Poirot stood still, considering the new layer of complexity in the case. Mrs. Ridgway's fear was palpable, but so too was her guilt. She had kept her silence for too long. She had protected Davenport for the sake of her own security, and in doing so, she had placed her trust in the wrong hands. "You protected him because you were afraid," Poirot murmured. "But now you know, madame, that your silence has contributed to the tragedy." Mrs. Ridgway's hands shook as she nodded. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but now I fear it's too late." Poirot straightened, his mind racing through the new revelations. The housekeeper's confession had opened a new door, but it had also complicated matters. Davenport had manipulated her, but there was still the matter of his involvement with Lady Carrington's death. And there was Robert Stone, whose volatile nature remained an enigma. Poirot turned to face the group once more, his voice steady but with an undeniable force behind it. "We are close now. The truth is within reach, but one more thing must be uncovered." He met each of their gazes in turn, his eyes piercing through them like a scalpel. "Tonight we will confront the final pieces of this puzzle," Poirot said. "The game is nearly over, and soon we will see who has truly been playing all along." A sharp silence followed his words, but Poirot could see the tension building within each suspect. The walls were closing in, and they knew it. There would be no more hiding. The truth would soon be revealed. The evening wore on, and the dim light of the sitting room grew more oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Poirot's mind was a whirlwind of theories, his little grey cells working overtime to untangle the web of deception, motives, and half-truths. Every answer, every word, every look from the suspects felt like a piece of the puzzle sliding into place, but there was still one more piece he needed to uncover. Mrs. Ridgway had confirmed his suspicions that Davenport had been involved in some capacity with Lady Carrington's troubles, but how deep did his involvement go? Poirot's gaze drifted toward the man, who sat now in the corner, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of unease. A subtle frown played at the corners of his lips, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Yet it was the way he glanced at the others, his eyes flitting over them as if calculating something that truly interested Poirot. Davenport was calculating. Yes, but was he guilty? Poirot let his gaze linger on him for a moment longer before turning his attention to the others. Henrietta, who had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, was now gazing out of the window, her fingers nervously touching the lace of her dress. There was something there, a shift in her composure, as though she too was trying to make sense of the puzzle. And Robert, who had retreated into the shadows, still maintained that same air of youthful arrogance. He was the one who had most to lose, and yet his alibi had been too clean, too perfect. Then there was Valerie, the widow who had confessed to being the last person to see Lady Carrington alive. Her story remained consistent, but something about her calm demeanor gnawed at Poirot. She was too composed, too ready to share her grief. Could she have been the mastermind behind this elaborate scheme? playing the role of the innocent victim? Or was she, too, a pawn in a game far more intricate than she knew? The tension in the room thickened, and Poirot knew that the time had come. "I am certain," he began, his voice steady but commanding, "that you are all holding back. Each of you has a part to play in this mystery, but there are pieces missing. And until I uncover those pieces, none of you will be free from suspicion." He paused, letting his words settle into the air. The silence that followed was almost deafening, and Poirot savored it. It was in moments like this, when everyone was on edge, when they feared the inevitable truth would be revealed, that the cracks in their facades would widen just enough for him to slip through. "I believe," Poirot continued, "that the key to unlocking this mystery lies not in what you've told me, but in what you haven't. You've all been too careful, too deliberate in your responses. But there are things you cannot hide, small signs that tell me there is more to this than meets the eye." He turned to Robert first, who stiffened at the mention of his name. "Monsieur Stone," Poirot said softly, "you were the one who found your mother's body, were you not?" Robert's face flushed slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, I found her in the library, just as I said." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "But when you first entered the room, you didn't immediately call for help, did you?" Robert's eyes widened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I was in shock," he said quickly. "I didn't know what to do." Poirot's expression remained unchanged. "Ah, yes. Shock. That's the excuse many use when they don't want to answer the difficult questions. But tell me, Monsieur Stone, did you search the room first? Did you see anything that might explain why your mother had been killed?" Robert hesitated, then nodded slowly. I saw the broken glass, the spilled wine, but nothing else seemed out of place." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing out of place? Yet we know that your mother had been planning to sell the house. You, Monsieur Stone, would have been the one most affected by such a decision, would you not?" Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. The tension in his shoulders was undeniable. "She was my mother," he said at last, his voice low. "Of course I would be affected. But not just emotionally," Poirot said, his voice piercing. "Monetarily, yes?" Robert shifted again, his gaze flickering to the others. "What do you mean?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Your inheritance, Monsieur Stone. You would have lost much if the house had been sold. That is motive, is it not?" Robert's face darkened, and Poirot could see the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. "I had nothing to do with her death," he said, his voice harsh. "I loved my mother. I never wanted her dead." Poirot studied him for a long moment, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the armrest of his chair. There was anger in Robert's words, but it was a defensive anger. It rang hollow, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "I believe you," Poirot said at last, his voice soft but firm. "You did not kill your mother, but you are hiding something. There is more to your involvement than you let on, but the question remains. What was your part in all this?" Robert's lips tightened into a thin line, but he didn't answer. Poirot then turned his attention to Valerie Carrington, whose demeanor had remained calm throughout the entire exchange. "Madame Carrington," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "you were the last person to see your mother-in-law alive. Tell me, how did you leave her that evening?" Valerie's eyes met his with a steady gaze, and she didn't flinch. "I left her sitting at her desk, writing," she said, her voice composed but with a hint of sadness. "She had been working on something all evening." "And you didn't see anything unusual?" Poirot pressed. "No signs of distress? No signs that something was wrong?" Valerie shook her head. "No, she was just working as she always did." Poirot studied her closely, his mind sifting through her words. There was no hesitation in her tone, but her answer was too neat, too perfect. "And yet," he said softly, "you knew that your mother-in-law was planning to sell the house. You knew she had become afraid of someone. Why didn't you warn her, madame?" Valerie's expression faltered just for a moment, and Poirot caught it. It was a brief flicker of guilt, but enough to make him take note. She had known, yes, and perhaps she had known more than she let on. Valerie began, but she stopped herself, her mouth snapping shut. "I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot." "Oh, but you do," Poirot said, his voice almost gentle now. "You see, Madame Carrington, I believe you know exactly what I'm implying, and I believe deep down you know that your involvement in this case runs deeper than you're willing to admit." Valerie's face remained neutral, but Poirot saw the tension in her shoulders. She was hiding something, just as the others were. It was only a matter of time before the last piece of the puzzle would be revealed. And Poirot had a feeling that the truth, once uncovered, would be far darker than any of them could have imagined. Sure, Minnie Poirot's eyes held Valerie's for a moment longer than was comfortable, as if silently challenging her to reveal the truth. Her facade was impeccable, but he could sense the cracks beneath it, small, almost imperceptible signs of strain. He knew she was close to breaking. It was only a matter of pushing just the right way. "I think, Madame Carrington," Poirot said softly, "that you are not as calm as you would like everyone to believe. The truth about your relationship with your mother-in-law, your knowledge of her fears, and your possible role in her demise is something I believe you are still hiding." Valerie's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and for the first time Poirot saw a flicker of defensiveness in her posture. She was on the verge of an emotional outburst, but she caught herself just in time. She remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together. Poirot took a step back, allowing the silence to stretch. He knew when to press and when to allow his subjects to marinate in their thoughts. There was nothing more dangerous than a guilty person who had been given a taste of doubt. It was in that space where the truth could break free. Before he could continue. There was a sharp knock on the door, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a dagger. Poirot turned his head sharply, his senses instantly alert. The interruption was unexpected, and that, in itself, was enough to make him suspicious. "Enter," he called, his voice calm yet commanding. The door creaked open, and the butler, his face pale and tight, stepped inside. He looked like a man who had just seen something unpleasant. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," the butler said, his voice shaky. "There's been a situation in the library." Poirot's mind immediately clicked into action. He didn't need to ask for details. The butler's nervousness was enough to tell him that something had gone terribly wrong. "The library?" Poirot repeated. "What is it?" "The door was locked from the inside, sir," the butler continued, his eyes darting nervously between the detective and the rest of the guests. "When we tried to open it, we found a body." A gasp went up from the others in the room, and Poirot felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He didn't need to be told who it was. "Lady Carrington?" he asked, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. The butler nodded, his face pale and stricken. "Yes, monsieur. It's her." Poirot rose from his chair with a sharp movement, his mind already racing. There had been a moment of tension earlier when he suspected that something was amiss, but now the game had changed. Another death, one that seemed almost inevitable in its timing, had thrown the investigation into even deeper uncertainty. He turned to the others. "Remain here," he ordered. "Do not speak to anyone. I will return shortly." Without waiting for her response, Poirot strode from the room, his mind a whirl of thoughts. The body, the locked door, the timing, all of it screamed of something far more elaborate than a simple crime of passion. Lady Carrington had been dead for only a short time, and yet her murder, in its apparent suddenness, felt calculated. He hurried to the library, the path leading him down a narrow hall, his footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. The butler followed close behind, guiding Poirot through the maze of corridors. The library was bathed in a gloomy twilight, the late afternoon light seeping weakly through the tall windows. It was a grand room, lined with bookshelves and heavy, dark furniture. The air smelled faintly of dust and leather, and Poirot felt a creeping sense of foreboding. Inside, the scene was grim. Lady Carrington lay sprawled on the floor in front of her desk, her hand still gripping the quill she must have dropped in her final moments. Her lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling, her expression frozen in shock and pain. Her once stately appearance was marred by the unnatural angle of her neck and the deep red stain spreading across the front of her gown. Poirot stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. The door was indeed locked from the inside, and there was no sign of forced entry. The window was closed, and the heavy drapes hung undisturbed. The room itself seemed untouched, save for the tragic figure in the center. He knelt beside the body, his gaze sweeping over every detail. "Who found her?" Poirot asked, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the gravity of the situation. The butler shifted uncomfortably. "It was Miss Henrietta, sir. She was the first to see the door open and found her lying like this." Poirot nodded but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked around the room, taking in the surroundings, noting the details that no one else might have noticed. There was a small stack of letters on the desk, one of them slightly askew. He picked it up delicately, examining the handwriting on the envelope. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a blank envelope with a faint smudge of ink on the front. "Interesting," Poirot muttered to himself. He turned to the butler. "Has anyone touched anything?" "No, monsieur. We didn't dare. We waited for you." Poirot nodded again, grateful for the butler's caution, but his mind was already elsewhere. There was something nagging at him about the scene. Something that didn't fit. Lady Carrington had been the one to call for help earlier, wasn't she? She'd been discussing a letter with someone. He had heard it in her voice when she had spoken to Valerie. Had it been a warning, a clue? Poirot's eyes lingered on the desk for a moment longer, but he moved on. He couldn't afford to miss anything. There was still the matter of the lock. No one had been able to enter the room without a key or the right combination to the locking mechanism. He turned back to the butler. "Who had access to this room besides the family?" The butler's eyes darted nervously. Well, anyone in the house has a key, Monsieur Poirot, but only the family and close staff would come in here without permission." Poirot's brow furrowed. "And you? You are sure that no one entered after Miss Henrietta found her?" The butler swallowed hard. "I cannot be certain, monsieur." Poirot's gaze sharpened. The butler's uncertainty was not lost on him. "Then we must question everyone," he said. "And it must be done swiftly. The truth, monsieur, lies not in what was found, but in who was closest when the final act occurred." As he turned to leave, Poirot's mind raced. Lady Carrington's murder was a puzzle, a twisted game of human nature, deceit, and revenge. The answer lay hidden in the choices the players had made, and it was time to begin piecing the last part of the puzzle together. Only then would the truth be uncovered. Poirot stood outside the library door, his mind racing as he mulled over the scene. The timing of Lady Carrington's death, following so closely after the earlier tensions during the toast, was no mere coincidence. It was a calculated move, one that fit perfectly with the undercurrent of hostility and deception that ran through the house. But what motive lay behind it? And who among the gathered guests could be so cold-blooded? He glanced back toward the assembled group in the drawing room, his sharp eyes assessing each face, searching for any hint of guilt, nervousness, or too perfect composure. They were all guilty of something, each in their own way. But who among them had the wherewithal to murder in such a controlled manner? Before Poirot could form a more coherent theory, the butler returned with Miss Henrietta, her pale face drawn with shock and fear. She was a slight woman in her early 30s, with delicate features that seemed to tremble beneath her well-practiced veneer of composure. The moment she stepped into the library, she seemed to shrink back as if the very presence of the room threatened to swallow her whole. Poirot took a moment to observe her, his mind instinctively searching for clues. She was the one who had found the body, but what was her role in the story? Was she an innocent bystander caught up in something much darker, or was she playing a part in something far more sinister? "Miss Henrietta," Poirot said, his voice calm but penetrating, "I must ask you to tell me exactly what happened. You discovered the body, yes?" Her eyes flickered toward the desk where her mother's body still lay, but she nodded, her lips trembling as she spoke. I did, Monsieur Poirot. I found her like that when I went to check on her. I'd just spoken to her earlier, and I thought I'd give her some time alone to rest. She had been acting so strange lately, but when I knocked and got no answer, I opened the door." Her voice faltered. "Please, take your time," Poirot said, his tone reassuring. "I understand this must be difficult." Henrietta blinked back tears but composed herself. "I saw her lying there like that. I tried to shake her awake, but there was no response. She choked on the words. "I knew something was terribly wrong, so I immediately called for help. I didn't touch anything." Poirot studied her with a sharp eye. Her story was consistent with the butler's account, but there was something in her voice. A quiver, a tremor that he couldn't ignore. Was it grief, or was it something else entirely? "Miss Henrietta," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm. "You are telling me that you did not touch anything, but are you sure you did not see something? Something that might explain how your mother came to be in that state?" Henrietta shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting nervously. I didn't notice anything unusual. I mean, I saw the papers on the desk, but that's all. The door was locked when I found her, just like it had been before. There's no way anyone could have come in and out without someone noticing, surely." Poirot's gaze hardened slightly. "And yet, Miss Henrietta, you have not yet told me whether you saw anyone leave the room. Think carefully, madame. The smallest detail, the smallest inconsistency in your memory could unravel the whole case." Henrietta blinked rapidly, her eyes suddenly wide. She was hiding something, but what? Poirot was certain now. There was more to her discovery than she was letting on. She had seen something, or perhaps someone. He continued, "You mentioned the letters on the desk. What was in them?" Henrietta's face paled further at the question, and for a moment Poirot could have sworn that she was about to break. Her eyes flitted toward the desk, and for just a split second, the vulnerability in her gaze flickered like a candle caught in a draught. I don't know, monsieur. I didn't look at the letters closely. She faltered. They were addressed to no one. Poirot's mind clicked. No one. The envelope that had been left behind, that had caught his attention earlier, there was a connection here. Why would someone send a letter with no address? And why had Henrietta been so unwilling to discuss it? He knew better than to push too hard now. Henrietta was at her breaking point. Instead, he turned to the butler. "Is the rest of the household still gathered in the drawing room?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot," the butler replied, his voice quieter now, a trace of fear still in his tone. "Everyone is waiting." "Good," Poirot said, his tone changing to one of resolve. "I need to speak to them all at once. Now." He motioned for Henrietta to leave the room and followed her out, his mind working at full speed. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still far too many gaps. One of the guests, one of them, had been directly involved in this murder. But which one? When Poirot re-entered the drawing room, he found the group still sitting as they had been before, their eyes full of anxious expectation. Valerie, who had been unnervingly calm up until now, seemed to be glancing at her watch every few moments, a nervous tick or perhaps a sign of impatience. Henrietta, her face still pale, quickly took her seat beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Poirot's gaze swept across the room, his eyes flicking over each of the guests in turn. The tension in the air was palpable now, as though they all knew the storm was about to break. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the seconds, each one growing more oppressive. Poirot took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but laden with authority, "the game has changed. A second death, and one that, I believe, brings us closer to the truth. You all knew that Lady Carrington was troubled, but not to this extent. She did not die by some random chance, nor was she simply a victim of circumstance. She was murdered." A collective gasp filled the room. Poirot's eyes locked onto each face, watching as they reacted. But it was Valerie's expression that caught his attention the most. Her face betrayed nothing, but her eyes, those eyes, told him everything he needed to know. "I know you are all in shock," Poirot continued, "but shock does not kill. Someone here, in this very room, knows more than they have said. I do not yet know who that is, but I will. The truth will come to light." With that, Poirot fell silent, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. There was no immediate response, but Poirot could feel the atmosphere shifting. Somewhere in that room was the one who had taken Lady Carrington's life, and soon they would slip up. The pieces were almost in place. The room fell into a tense silence after Poirot's declaration. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting nervously toward one another. But it was Valerie who broke the stillness, her calm composure flickering ever so slightly. "You cannot be serious, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice a perfect mix of concern and disbelief. Lady Carrington was hardly in a state to be murdered. She was a woman in fragile health, certainly, but the idea that someone here would— Her voice trailed off as if the words themselves were too much to bear. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Valerie's. "Indeed, it is difficult to believe. But as we know, appearances can be deceiving, and Lady Carrington was not the weak and frail woman you may have assumed. She was, in fact, a master at hiding her true condition as well as her true thoughts." Valerie seemed to stiffen at the remark, her fingers tightening around the edges of her chair. Poirot watched, his gaze sharp. The smallest twitch, the tightness of her grip. It all spoke volumes to him. She was reacting too strongly. Valerie knew something. "I am sorry to press you," Poirot continued, his voice soft but insistent. "But I must ask you to recall everything that transpired this evening. You were all present at the toast. You knew Lady Carrington well, yes? Tell me, did she give you any indication, any sign that she was threatened in any way?" Valerie opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Her fingers fluttered nervously to her necklace, her eyes briefly flicking toward the door. Well, she seemed off, but—" She faltered again, and Poirot could see the inner turmoil reflected on her face. She wasn't one to express concerns openly, especially not about her own safety. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled together in front of him. "That is true, Valerie. Lady Carrington had a way of keeping her troubles hidden. But she did say something, did she not? Something that perhaps you did not take seriously at the time. A hint, perhaps, of who she feared." A beat of silence passed before Valerie's eyes flickered down, as if the words were finally coming to her. She did mention something, but I thought it was nothing more than a passing remark." "What did she say?" Poirot asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Valerie hesitated, looking around the room at the other guests. Henrietta's face remained impassive, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. As Valerie turned her gaze to the others, Poirot saw a subtle shift in the dynamic. No one spoke, but they were all listening intently. "She said she didn't trust someone," Valerie finally whispered, lowering her voice, as though the words might somehow carry too much weight if spoken aloud. "She didn't name names, but she said someone close to her was plotting something. She was—" Valerie paused, collecting her thoughts. She was afraid. Poirot's heart quickened. This was the break he had been waiting for. Lady Carrington had known. She had sensed the threat, but she had been unable or unwilling to name her assailant. The question now was whether Valerie had any idea who the someone was. And did she say anything else? Anything that could help me understand her fear? Poirot pressed gently, his tone as soft as a whisper, coaxing the truth from Valerie's lips. Valerie hesitated, her face still pale, but her eyes now clouded with doubt. She shook her head slowly. No, nothing else. She wouldn't say more. I think she was trying to protect someone, perhaps to keep us from suspecting. Poirot remained silent, mulling over her words. Protect someone. Was it possible that Lady Carrington's final moments were spent shielding another? Perhaps she had known more than she let on, more than even Valerie had realized. The mind of a woman in danger, Poirot said, his voice trailing off as he turned his gaze to the others in the room. A mind torn between fear and love, loyalty and suspicion. This, too, is a clue. The words hung in the air like a weight, and Poirot's gaze swept across the faces of the others, his sharp eyes seeking out any sign of guilt or unease. He paused for a moment, watching Valerie closely. There was more. He could feel it. Valerie's nervousness now was more than the fear of having been caught in a lie. It was the fear of revealing something deeper, something far more dangerous. Poirot turned his attention to Henrietta. "Miss Henrietta," he said, his voice turning cold, "tell me, when you discovered the body, was there anything unusual about the room? Anything that might suggest someone had entered or left?" Henrietta's eyes widened, and she shook her head fervently. No, Monsieur Poirot. The room was locked when I found it. It was just as it had been before, except for my mother." "Except for your mother," Poirot repeated, his voice taking on a certain finality. "But what about the letters on the desk? Did you not notice something strange about them?" Henrietta hesitated, her face paling once more. I don't know. I told you, I didn't look at them closely. You did not look at them closely," Poirot interrupted, his voice quiet but insistent. "But I suspect there is something in those letters, Miss Henrietta. Something that will tell us who your mother feared. Perhaps a name, perhaps a warning, something important." Henrietta's lips trembled as she opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to elude her. She clutched her hands together tightly in her lap. "I don't know anything about it, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't—" She broke off suddenly, as though something had clicked into place in her mind. Her eyes flickered toward the desk again, and Poirot followed her gaze. "Do you see something now, Miss Henrietta?" he asked quietly. Henrietta's expression had shifted, her earlier confusion replaced by a look of dawning realization. "The letter," she whispered. "The letter that was on the desk. It wasn't for her." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. "Tell me more," he urged. Henrietta swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "The letter wasn't for Lady Carrington. It was addressed to someone else. Someone she had been trying to keep secret. Someone who had been with her." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Who, Miss Henrietta? Who was it addressed to?" Henrietta paused, as if she feared the words she was about to say. "It was addressed to Valerie," she murmured. The silence that followed was deafening. The pieces were finally falling into place. Lady Carrington's fear had been justified. The threat she had feared was real, and it was sitting in this very room, staring back at Poirot. Valerie. Valerie's face remained carefully composed, but her eyes betrayed her. That name on the letter, its very presence, had cracked the serene mask she had worn so flawlessly all evening. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words emerged. Poirot waited. He had no need to press her. Silence was often more revealing than protest. Henrietta glanced down, almost ashamed to have uttered the name. "I didn't think it meant anything at the time," she whispered, half to herself. I just thought it must have been some personal correspondence, but now, Valerie finally found her voice. Surely you're not suggesting that a letter addressed to me implicates me in anything. Her tone had turned sharp, and a thin tremor had crept into her voice, like a violin string pulled too tightly. Lady Carrington and I were very close. She wrote to me often. Oui, mademoiselle, that is just it, Poirot said softly, yet firmly. You were close, and yet she feared someone close to her. A paradox, unless the person she feared was precisely the one she trusted the most. Valerie's lips pressed into a line, the color slowly draining from her cheeks. That's a dangerous assumption, Monsieur Poirot. Not an assumption, Poirot replied. A deduction, based on the facts. Shall I enumerate them? He took a measured step forward, his eyes moving between Valerie and the rest of the room. Lady Carrington was not poisoned by accident. The champagne was tampered with. Only someone with knowledge of her routine and access to the drinks before the toast could have done it. She poured it herself, Valerie said quickly. We all saw her. Ah, but the bottle, Poirot corrected. The bottle was opened prior to her entrance, yes? It sat waiting in the drawing room, unwatched, untested, and you, mademoiselle, were one of the few who had time alone in that room just before we gathered. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Valerie's gaze flicked to the others. No one came to her defense, not even Henrietta. She straightened in her seat, her composure returning in brittle, artificial layers. You forget, she said coolly, that I am not the only one who knew her habits. You forget Henrietta. You forget the staff. Non, I forget nothing, Poirot said, the gentleness in his voice gone now. I have spoken to the staff. Their movements were accounted for. Henrietta, too, was with guests until the final minutes. But you, Valerie, you disappeared. For exactly 12 minutes, and in those 12 minutes the opportunity arose. Valerie drew in a slow breath, folding her hands in her lap. And what would my motive be, Monsieur Poirot? Do you suggest I killed my closest friend out of boredom? Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. Ah, but that is the question, is it not? The motive. It has eluded me until now, but then came the letter. This mysterious letter addressed to you. Tell me, mademoiselle, where is it? Valerie hesitated. I have no idea what Henrietta is referring to. Interesting, Poirot said, because the letter is no longer among Lady Carrington's things. I checked myself. If it was never delivered to you and is no longer in her possession, then one must ask, who took it? No answer came. Poirot let the silence work its magic again. He saw the faint tremble in Valerie's fingertips as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I believe, he said, that Lady Carrington discovered something about you, perhaps something from your past, a secret, a betrayal, and she confronted you. Not with anger, but disappointment. You were her confidant, after all. Valerie's jaw tightened. You're spinning a story with no proof. But there is proof, Poirot replied. In the ledger hidden in her desk, the one Henrietta did not know about. It contains notes, brief, careful, cryptic. One entry reads, V lied, again, must speak before it's too late. You see? Even in her final days, Lady Carrington sensed what was coming, but she hesitated. Why? Because she still hoped it wasn't true. The air in the room grew colder, and even Henrietta seemed to shrink back slightly in her chair. Valerie, though, held her, ground, barely. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. You don't understand. She wasn't innocent either. She had her secrets. We all do. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Then perhaps you would care to enlighten us. But Valerie said nothing. She stared at Poirot with something like hatred in her eyes. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too close to the truth. You came here tonight, Poirot continued, believing the matter closed. You thought the story would end with Lady Carrington's death, an unfortunate health complication, nothing more. But the mind of Hercule Poirot, it notices what others overlook. The detail that will undo you, mademoiselle, is in the champagne. A ripple went through the room. I had the remaining contents of the bottle examined. A rare poison, digitalis, derived from foxglove. It mimics heart failure, and conveniently, Lady Carrington already had a heart condition. The perfect cover, no? Valerie blinked, slow and deliberate. If you have the poison, why ask all these questions? Because, Poirot said, stepping forward again, poison does not explain motive. Motive reveals the heart, and with you, mademoiselle, I believe it lies in the matter of inheritance. Not money? No. Something deeper. He turned to Henrietta. Tell me, mademoiselle, did your mother ever mention the contents of her most recent will? Henrietta shook her head. No, she changed it recently, but she didn't say what it was. Of course she didn't, Poirot said, because the change would have caused an uproar. You see, Valerie stood to inherit something far more valuable than money. She was to be named executor of the Carrington Foundation, a seat of power, prestige, and influence. Lady Carrington had mentored her for years. But that decision changed. The new will, which I suspect is now missing, named someone else. Henrietta's eyes widened. You mean... She changed her mind. Poirot nodded. Yes, and Valerie found out. That was the betrayal, not from Valerie to Lady Carrington, but the other way around. In Valerie's eyes, she had earned it. She was owed, and when she realized it was slipping away, she took action. Valerie stood slowly, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Poirot wondered if she would speak, if she would confess. But she simply said, "This is madness." "Is it?" Poirot said, his voice now calm and final. "Then let us prove it. The constables are already en route, and if I am wrong, the evidence will fail me. But if I am right, and I am, then justice, mademoiselle, will not." Valerie took a single step backward. Her eyes flicked once more to the others, but they offered her nothing. Henrietta looked stricken. The other guests sat frozen, unwilling to speak. As the sound of footsteps approached from the hall, the constables arriving, Valerie's mask crumbled just enough for Poirot to see it. The raw flicker of desperation. She knew the game was over. And still, somewhere in her eyes, Poirot saw something else. Not guilt, not fear, resentment.